Both fell into the water, but the millionaire husband saved his mistress and ignored his pregnant wife. She lost her baby, she walked away, and he lived with regret. But what she did after, no one on this earth could ever imagine. Stay with me, because this story will leave you speechless until the very end. Hi, my beautiful family. Today I want to pray with you from the depth of my heart. Heavenly God, I lift every member of this family before you. Bless the women who carry strength in silence. Bless the mothers who pray in the night. Bless the daughters whose dreams are waiting to shine. Heal those who are sick, comfort those who are broken, and give peace to every heart that listens to these stories with love. But my family, I must also speak with truth. In the last few days, many of you have stopped watching the full stories. You leave in the middle, and this hurts me deeply. It feels as if my hard work means nothing. I stay awake, I write, I pour my soul into every story, not for myself, but for you. Because I love you. I know some who are new here may have trust issues, but trust is built with love, and I have always given you my heart without hiding anything. I'm not here to play games. I'm here to build a family, a place of love, respect, and togetherness. So I ask you today, if your heart is true, write present. If your love is real, write, I am with Mr. Peter. Money could buy everything except the one thing Tom Collins had already destroyed, his own soul. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting golden rays across marble floors that cost more than most people's homes. Tom Collins stood at the edge of his private terrace, overlooking the city he had conquered through ruthless ambition and calculated moves. At 42, he possessed everything the world deemed valuable: a tech empire worth $8 billion, influence that reached into government corridors, and a reputation that made grown men tremble during boardroom negotiations. But as he adjusted his Armani suit and checked his Patek Philippe watch, Tom felt nothing but cold emptiness where satisfaction should have been. "Tom, your coffee's getting cold." The soft voice belonged to Alison Murphy, the woman who had shared his bed and his name for the past 5 years. She stood in the doorway wearing a silk robe that complemented her dark skin beautifully, her natural hair framing a face that still carried traces of the vulnerability that had first attracted him. Once, that voice had been music to his ears. Once, her gentle presence had been the anchor that kept him grounded in humanity. Now, it felt like chains around his neck. "I'll be right there," he replied without turning around, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who had learned to lie with the fluency of a native speaker. The irony wasn't lost on him. The woman who had taught him how to love had become the woman he was learning to resent. Alison Murphy hadn't always lived in penthouses. 5 years ago, she had been sleeping in a downtown shelter, one meal away from starvation, when Tom's limousine had broken down 3 blocks away. He had been walking to clear his head after another failed business negotiation when he spotted her sharing her meager dinner with an elderly homeless man who looked even hungrier than she did. That moment of selfless compassion had stopped Tom in his tracks. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, here was a woman giving away the little she had to someone who needed it more. He had approached her, expecting nothing, offering help, and finding instead a conversation that lasted until dawn. Alison had been different, genuine in a way that money couldn't manufacture. She laughed at his jokes not because he was rich, but because she found him genuinely funny. She challenged his cynical worldview with optimism that wasn't naive, but earned through surviving genuine hardship. When she looked at him, she saw Tom the man, not Tom the billionaire. Their courtship had been a revelation. For the first time in his adult life, Tom experienced love without calculation, affection without agenda. Alison had refused his gifts initially, suspicious of his motives, making him work to earn her trust. When she finally accepted his proposal, It was because she believed in the man she thought he was becoming, not the empire he had built. The wedding had been featured in Forbes, Vanity Fair, and every major lifestyle magazine. Tech Titan finds love with homeless woman had been the headline that launched 1,000 think pieces about second chances and the humanizing power of love. Allison had hated the attention, but Tom had basked in the positive publicity that portrayed him as a man capable of seeing beyond surface appearances. For 2 years, the fairy tale had been real. Tom found himself softening, making decisions based on ethical considerations rather than pure profit. Allison's influence had led him to establish charitable foundations, fund homeless shelters, and implement progressive employee benefits at his companies. She had made him a better man, and he had genuinely believed that their love would last forever. But success had a way of corrupting even the purest intentions. The transformation had been gradual, so subtle that Tom hadn't noticed it happening until it was complete. The charitable work had become tax write-offs. The employee benefits had become PR talking points. The man who had fallen in love with a homeless woman's compassion had reverted to the calculating predator who viewed human connections as business transactions. "Tom," Allison's voice carried a note of concern now, "you seem a million miles away lately." He turned to face her, forcing his expression into the mask of loving husband he had perfected through months of practice. Allison stood backlit by the morning sun, and for a moment, Tom glimpsed the woman he had fallen in love with. Her beauty wasn't the manufactured perfection of magazine covers. It was real, earned through struggle, refined by kindness. But the moment passed, replaced by irritation that she couldn't simply leave him alone with his thoughts. "Just thinking about the Patterson deal," he lied smoothly. The Patterson deal had been closed for weeks. He had been thinking about last night, about hands that weren't Allison's exploring his body with hungry desperation. Allison nodded, accepting his explanation with the trust that made his deception both easier and more despicable. She had never questioned his late nights, his weekend business trips, or the subtle changes in his behavior. Her faith in him remained absolute, making her the perfect victim for his betrayal. "I made your favorite breakfast," she said, gesturing toward the dining room. "Blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup." The domestic gesture that once would have melted his heart now felt like performance art, a wife playing a role in a marriage that existed only in her imagination. But Tom smiled and followed her into the dining room, settling into his chair at the head of a table that could seat 20, but now felt cavernous with just the two of them. As Allison bustled around the kitchen, humming softly while she plated his breakfast with the care of someone still believing in love, Tom's phone buzzed with a message that made his pulse quicken despite himself. The text was brief, but loaded with meaning. "Last night was incredible. I can't wait to see you again." Tom deleted the message and looked up to find Allison watching him with curious eyes that were beginning to show signs of suspicion. "Work emergency?" she asked, setting a plate of perfect pancakes before him. "Something like that," he muttered, cutting into the breakfast with more violence than necessary. The pancakes were exactly as he liked them, light, fluffy, with just the right amount of sweetness. Allison had memorized his preferences and catered to them without being asked. The gesture should have moved him. Instead, it felt like another obligation in a life increasingly defined by suffocating expectations. "I was thinking," Allison said, settling into her own chair with a smaller portion, "maybe we could take a vacation soon, just the two of us. Remember that little bed and breakfast in Napa where we went for our second anniversary?" Tom remembered. They had spent 3 days drinking wine, talking until dawn, making love with a passion that had surprised them both. It had been the last time he could honestly say he had been completely happy in his marriage. "I can't get away right now," he said, not meeting her eyes. "The Singapore expansion is at a critical phase." It wasn't entirely a lie. The Singapore expansion was happening, but Tom's direct involvement wasn't necessary. He had capable people handling the details. What he couldn't admit was that the idea of being alone with Alison for 3 days, pretending to be the loving husband she deserved, felt like psychological torture. Alison's face fell slightly, but she recovered quickly, forcing brightness into her voice. "Of course, I understand. Maybe when things slow down." "Maybe," Tom agreed, knowing he had no intention of honoring the promise. He had become an expert at offering future possibilities while ensuring they never materialized. The rest of breakfast passed in silence, punctuated by Alison's attempts at conversation and Tom's monosyllabic responses. She asked about his day, his meetings, his plans for the weekend. He answered with the minimum required words, while his mind wandered to forbidden territory. Soft curves, whispered promises, the intoxication of desire that felt like drowning and flying simultaneously. When his phone rang, Tom felt a surge of relief. "I have to take this," he announced, already standing. "But you haven't finished your—" "It's important," he cut her off, walking toward his study. The call was from his assistant about a routine scheduling matter, nothing that required immediate attention, but it provided escape from the domestic scene that felt increasingly like a prison. Through the study's glass doors, Tom watched Alison clear the breakfast dishes with careful precision. She moved through their home like a woman trying not to disturb the peace, as if making too much noise might shatter whatever remained of their relationship. The sight should have moved him to compassion. Instead, it filled him with inexplicable anger. When had her consideration become irritating? When had her love become burden rather than blessing? When had he become the kind of man who could look at genuine devotion and feel only contempt? The questions haunted him as he prepared for another day of maintaining the illusion that Tom Collins was a man worthy of respect. His employees would see the decisive leader, his business partners would see the brilliant strategist, and the media would see the reformed billionaire who had found love with a homeless woman. Chapter 2. The Other Woman. Some women were born to destroy empires. Jamie Hunter was born to rule them. The glass elevator climbed 47 floors in complete silence, carrying Jamie Hunter toward her destiny with the mechanical precision of a weapon being loaded for firing. Each floor that passed beneath her feet represented another step closer to the throne she had been planning to claim since the moment she first laid eyes on Tom Collins 6 months ago at a technology conference where fortunes were made and destroyed based on 15-minute presentations. At 28, Jamie possessed the kind of calculated beauty that turned heads and emptied bank accounts, auburn hair that caught light like fire, green eyes that promised everything and delivered exactly what served her purposes, and a smile sharp enough to cut glass, and twice as dangerous to men who mistook beauty for innocence. She wasn't beautiful by accident or genetic lottery. Every aspect of her appearance had been carefully cultivated through years of study and investment, from the designer clothes that hugged her curves in precisely calculated ways to the perfume that lingered in men's memories long after she left the room like a signature written in pheromones. Jamie Hunter was a weapon disguised as a woman, and Tom Collins was about to discover just how lethal she could be when properly motivated by ambition that knew no boundaries. The elevator doors opened to reveal the executive floor of Collins Tech, a testament to modern power rendered in steel and glass that reflected light like scattered diamonds across surfaces designed to intimidate lesser mortals. Tom's assistant, an efficient woman who had learned to recognize importance in its many forms through years of managing access to one of the world's most powerful men, gestured toward the corner office without being asked or needing verbal confirmation. Jamie had that effect on people. They instinctively knew she belonged wherever she chose to be, as if confidence itself was a passport that granted access to restricted territories. "Mr. Collins is expecting you," the assistant said, with the deference reserved for those who mattered in Tom's world of hierarchies and careful calculations of worth. Jamie's heels clicked against the marble floor like a countdown timer, marking the seconds until her carefully laid plans would bear fruit that had been months in cultivation. 6 months of strategic positioning, calculated encounters, and perfectly timed vulnerability had led to this moment of truth. Most women chased powerful men with obvious desperation that repelled more than it attracted, making themselves easy to dismiss and impossible to respect. Jamie had learned to make them chase her with hunger that bordered on madness, using psychology and manipulation techniques that would have impressed professional interrogators. The door to Tom's office opened before she could knock, revealing the man who had become both her obsession and her opportunity for advancement into circles of power that most people could only dream about accessing. Tom Collins stood silhouetted against floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city below, every inch of his domain spread out like a kingdom awaiting conquest by someone clever enough to take it. Everything about his office had been designed to intimidate through psychological warfare. The massive desk that could serve as a landing strip for small aircraft, the awards covering every wall like trophies from conquered enemies, the subtle reminders of his wealth and influence scattered throughout the space like landmines waiting to explode lesser mortals' confidence and self-worth. But Jamie wasn't intimidated by displays of power that she intended to claim for herself. She was inspired by the possibilities they represented. "You came," Tom said, and Jamie heard something in his voice that hadn't been there during their business meetings. Hunger barely contained beneath professional courtesy, need disguised as control, weakness masquerading as strength. "Did you think I wouldn't?" she replied, stepping into his office and closing the door behind her with deliberate care. The click of the lock was soft but definitive, transforming the space from a place of business into something far more dangerous and infinitely more intimate than either of them was willing to admit aloud. Jamie had met Tom 3 years ago at a tech conference in Silicon Valley, where fortunes were made and lost based on 15-minute presentations and chance encounters in hotel lobbies that could change entire life trajectories. She had been working for a startup that was struggling to survive in an ecosystem dominated by predators like Tom, while he had been the keynote speaker whose every word moved stock prices and whose casual observations could create or destroy entire companies with the power of his reputation alone. Their first conversation had been purely professional. She had approached him with a business proposal that was actually solid, well-researched, and potentially profitable, rather than the desperate schemes most entrepreneurs brought to his attention. Unlike the dozens of hopeful founders who pitched him weekly, with half-baked ideas and wishful thinking disguised as business plans, Jamie had done her homework with the thoroughness of a scholar preparing for oral examination by experts who could destroy careers with a single question. She understood his business philosophy better than his own executives, his investment patterns with greater clarity than his financial advisors, his weaknesses and strengths with more precision than his therapist would have possessed if he had been honest enough to seek professional help for his character flaws. She spoke to him as an equal rather than a supplicant, begging for scraps from his table, challenging his assumptions with intelligence that impressed him and confidence that intrigued him in ways that pure beauty could never accomplish. Jamie had studied the psychology of powerful men with academic rigor, learning that they craved intellectual stimulation more than physical attraction, respect more than worship, challenge more than submission. That first meeting had led to a consulting contract worth 6 figures, which had led to regular strategy sessions conducted in his office after business hours, which had gradually evolved into something neither of them had initially intended, but both had secretly desired from the moment they recognized each other as predators operating in the same hunting ground. Jamie had watched Tom's marriage with clinical detachment worthy of a behavioral scientist, noting the subtle signs of his growing dissatisfaction with the dedication of someone studying a fascinating specimen under laboratory conditions. She had observed how he interacted with Alison at public events, the practiced affection that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, the careful distance that spoke of emotional retreat from intimacy, the way his eyes sought escape even during moments that should have been intimate and connecting. Jamie understood men like Tom Collins with the expertise of someone who had made a career of studying and exploiting their psychological weaknesses for personal advancement. They were conquerors by nature, driven by the thrill of acquisition rather than the satisfaction of possession, always seeking new territories to claim and new challenges to overcome. Once they owned something completely, it lost its appeal and became just another asset to be managed rather than a prize to be won through effort and strategy. Alison's complete devotion, which had initially attracted Tom like a moth to flame, had become the very thing that made him take her for granted and seek excitement elsewhere. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week," Jamie said, moving to the window and standing just close enough to Tom that he could smell her perfume, a scent chosen specifically for its ability to cloud judgment and inspire reckless decisions in men who believed themselves immune to manipulation. About market expansion and strategic partnerships that could reshape our entire approach to business development. It was code, and they both knew it. Their business discussions had become increasingly personal over the past months, professional language serving as thin camouflage for growing attraction that threatened to consume them both in ways that would have consequences neither was prepared to face honestly. Jamie had perfected the art of plausible deniability through years of practice. Every interaction could be explained as legitimate business if anyone questioned their relationship. Every touch could be dismissed as accidental contact. Every meaningful glance could be reframed as professional interest rather than personal desire. "Which aspect specifically?" Tom asked, his voice rough with barely suppressed desire that made his wedding ring feel like a tourniquet, cutting off circulation to his conscience and moral reasoning. Jamie turned to face him, letting her eyes meet his with the direct gaze that had first caught his attention months ago during a board meeting where she had dismantled a competitor's proposal with surgical precision that had impressed everyone present. The part about taking calculated risks for exponential rewards that could change everything we think we know about success. The double meaning hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything in its path, including the marriage that stood between Jamie and the life she had decided she deserved through superior intelligence and strategic thinking. Tom stepped closer, close enough that Jamie could see the conflict warring in his eyes, guilt battling with want, responsibility wrestling with rebellion, marriage vows crumbling under the weight of desire that felt like destiny but was actually manipulation disguised as fate. She had spent months studying that expression with the dedication of a scientist analyzing data, learning to read the micro-expressions that revealed his internal battle between the man he pretended to be and the man he actually was underneath his carefully constructed public persona. It was the look of a man who knew he was about to make a terrible decision and couldn't stop himself from making it anyway because his capacity for self-control had been systematically undermined through psychological techniques that Jamie had perfected on previous targets. "Jamie," he began, but she silenced him by placing one finger against his lips with the gentle authority of someone who understood exactly how much power she now wielded over his decisions and future choices. "Don't think," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear in a way that short-circuited rational thought and activated primitive brain functions that cared nothing for consequences or morality. "Just feel." The kiss that followed was inevitable as gravity, violent in its intensity and desperate in its execution. Tom kissed her like a man drowning in his own desire, and Jamie responded with the calculated passion of someone who understood exactly how much power she now wielded over a man who had built an empire but couldn't control his own appetites. This wasn't love. It was conquest disguised as romance, ambition wearing the mask of affection, manipulation perfected through years of practice on lesser targets who had taught her valuable lessons about the weaknesses of powerful men. Jamie Hunter was patient, calculating, and absolutely certain that she would win this game she had created because she had never met anyone who played it better than she did. Chapter 3. Signs of New Life. Hope was the cruelest gift life could offer a woman whose husband had already chosen another. Alison Murphy stared at the pregnancy test with trembling hands, watching as 2 pink lines appeared to confirm what her body had been telling her for weeks. After 5 years of marriage and 2 years of unsuccessful trying, she was finally carrying Tom's baby. The irony cut deep. She had gotten pregnant during the worst period of their marriage, when Tom seemed most distant and disconnected from their life together. But maybe this was exactly what they needed. Maybe a baby would remind Tom of what truly mattered, would bring him back from whatever cold place he had retreated to in recent months. Maybe their love could be reborn, along with their first child. The bathroom tiles were cold against her bare feet as she sat on the edge of the bathtub, holding the test like a sacred relic. Through the door, she could hear Tom moving around their bedroom, getting ready for another day of meetings that seemed to consume more of his attention than his wife ever did. Part of her wanted to burst through that door immediately and share the miraculous news. But another part, the part that had learned to read the warning signs in his behavior, urged caution. Tom had been different lately in ways that went beyond normal work stress. He answered his phone in hushed tones, left the room for calls he claimed were business-related, and came home carrying the subtle scent of perfume that wasn't hers. When she tried to discuss her concerns, he deflected with the skill of a man who had practiced deception until it became natural as breathing. But a baby would change everything. A baby would give him a reason to fight for their marriage instead of running from it. Alison spent the morning planning how to share the news. She wanted the moment to be perfect, memorable, worthy of the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a pregnancy. It was a miracle, a second chance, a bridge back to the man she had fallen in love with. The idea came to her while she was watering the orchids in their greenhouse terrace, a party. Not just any party, but an elegant gathering of their closest friends and business associates. She would make the announcement publicly, surrounded by people who would witness Tom's joy and hold him accountable to the happiness he would surely feel. Alison threw herself into the planning with the desperation of a woman trying to save her marriage through sheer force of will. She hired the best caterers, arranged for live music, and sent invitations to everyone who mattered in their social circle. The party would be sophisticated but warm, impressive but intimate, a perfect reflection of the life she still believed they could have together. For 3 weeks, she worked tirelessly to create an event worthy of their announcement. She chose a menu of Tom's favorite foods, selected wines that would complement the evening's mood, and arranged flowers that would transform their penthouse into a Garden of Eden. Every detail was planned with military precision and executed with love that bordered on obsession. The florists worked for days to create arrangements that would photograph beautifully while maintaining intimate atmosphere. The musicians were briefed on the exact moment when they should transition from background ambiance to celebratory fanfare. Even the lighting was adjusted multiple times to ensure the perfect balance between elegance and warmth. Tom seemed pleased by her efforts, though Alison noticed he showed more interest in the guest list than the celebration itself. He suggested adding several names she didn't recognize, business contacts he claimed were important for upcoming deals. Alison agreed without question, trusting his judgment about their professional obligations. She didn't know that one of those names belonged to Jamie Hunter. The morning of the party, Alison stood in their walk-in closet, surveying dresses that could accommodate her barely visible pregnancy while still making her feel beautiful. She chose a flowing emerald gown that complemented her skin tone and made her feel like the woman Tom had fallen in love with. As she applied makeup with unusual care, Alison allowed herself to imagine Tom's reaction when she shared their news. He would be shocked first, then overjoyed. He would sweep her into his arms and spin her around while their guests applauded. He would look at her with the love that had been missing from his eyes for months. He would remember why he had chosen her, why their love story had captivated the world, why their future together was worth fighting for. The fantasy sustained her through the final preparations, through the arrival of caterers and musicians, through the transformation of their home into a stage for what she believed would be the most important performance of their marriage. As the first guests began arriving, Alison took her place beside Tom at the entrance, playing the role of perfect hostess while her heart hammered with anticipation. She had planned every moment of the evening except the one that would destroy everything she held dear. Tom stood beside her, handsome in his custom tuxedo, greeting their guests with the charm that had built his empire. But Alison noticed how his eyes searched the crowd, looking for someone who hadn't yet arrived. She noticed how he checked his phone repeatedly, reading messages that made him smile in ways that had nothing to do with their celebration. "Are you expecting someone specific?" she asked during a brief lull between arrivals. "Just making sure all the important people are here," Tom replied, his attention already shifting to the next guest walking through their door. Alison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Something was wrong, fundamentally and irreversibly wrong, but she couldn't identify what it was. The feeling settled in her stomach like ice, competing with the new life growing there for space and attention. As more guests filled their home with laughter and conversation, Alison retreated to the kitchen to check on final preparations. The caterers moved with professional efficiency, creating culinary art that would impress their sophisticated guests. Everything was perfect, except for the growing sense of dread that Alison couldn't shake. When she returned to the party, she found Tom engaged in intense conversation with a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was stunning in a predatory way, all sharp angles and calculating smiles. She stood too close to Tom, touched his arm too familiarly, and looked at him with hunger that made Alison's blood turn cold. "Who is that?" Alison asked their mutual friend Rebecca, nodding toward the mysterious woman. "Jamie Hunter," Rebecca replied with obvious distaste. "Some kind of business consultant. I'm surprised Tom invited her. She has quite a reputation." Alison watched as Jamie laughed at something Tom said, throwing her head back in a gesture that was both sensual and dismissive. The woman moved through their home like she belonged there, like she had every right to claim space in Alison's world. The realization hit Alison with the force of physical violence. This was the other woman. This was why Tom had been distant, why he left the room for phone calls, why he came home smelling like foreign perfume. The pregnancy announcement that was supposed to save their marriage was about to become the moment she learned it was already dead. Her hands moved instinctively to her abdomen, protecting the life growing there from knowledge that would devastate them both. Alison Murphy was about to announce new life to a man who had already chosen another woman to share his future. Chapter 4. The Drowning Point. In the moment when everything changed forever, Tom Collins revealed exactly who he had become. The party had reached its crescendo of elegant conversation and refined laughter when disaster struck with the sudden violence of a lightning bolt splitting a perfect sky, transforming paradise into purgatory in the space of a heartbeat. Alison stood beside the infinity pool that overlooked the city like a liquid mirror, reflecting 1,000 dreams that were about to shatter into irreparable fragments, her heart pounding so violently she could feel it in her throat as she prepared to make the announcement that would change their lives forever. She had gathered their guests around the illuminated water that seemed to glow with promise under the carefully arranged lighting, champagne glasses catching the ethereal light like liquid diamonds suspended in time, each face turned toward her with anticipation that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice carrying across the terrace with nervous excitement that she desperately hoped sounded like joy rather than the desperation of a woman trying to save her marriage through sheer force of will. "Tom and I have something very special to share with everyone who means so much to us." But Tom wasn't listening to his wife's carefully prepared words that she had rehearsed dozens of times in front of their bedroom mirror. His attention was fixed entirely on Jamie Hunter, with the laser focus of a predator stalking prey, completely oblivious to the woman who was about to announce she was carrying his child. Jamie stood at the far edge of the gathering, wearing a dress that seemed designed to capture every eye in the vicinity, while making every other woman feel inadequate by comparison, including the wife whose moment this was supposed to be. The red silk clung to her body like a second skin painted on by an artist obsessed with perfection, and when she moved, it was with the predatory grace of a woman who knew exactly what effect she was having on the man who was supposed to be celebrating his wife's announcement, but couldn't tear his gaze away from his mistress. "As many of you know," Alison continued, her voice growing stronger as she drew courage from the life growing inside her, unaware that she was speaking to a crowd whose attention was divided between her words and the obvious tension crackling between her husband and his mysterious guest, like electricity before a storm that would destroy everything in its path. "Tom and I have been hoping for this moment for a very long time." The words hung in the air, like a prayer offered to gods who had already decided to answer with cruelty instead of blessing. The accident happened in slow motion, each second stretching into eternity as chaos erupted around the peaceful gathering like a bomb exploding in a cathedral during Sunday service. Jamie had been standing too close to the pool's edge, her expensive heels perched precariously on marble that had been polished to mirror brightness, leaning forward to hear something Tom was whispering in her ear with the intimacy of lovers sharing secrets that couldn't be spoken aloud without destroying the facade they were both maintaining. The other guest, a business associate whose name would be forgotten in the chaos but whose clumsiness would change multiple lives forever, bumped into Jamie while reaching for champagne from a passing waiter's silver tray, his elbow catching her shoulder with enough force to upset the delicate balance she had been maintaining on stiletto heels that were designed for beauty rather than stability. She stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping on the wet marble that surrounded the pool like a death trap disguised as luxury, arms windmilling desperately as she fought for balance that had already been lost to physics and poor positioning. The collision sent her crashing into the water with a splash that sent waves across the perfectly maintained surface like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, shattering the evening's carefully constructed perfection in an instant. The impact was violent enough to create a secondary collision that pulled Alison into the disaster she had been watching with growing horror and dawning realization about her husband's true priorities. She had been processing the sight of her husband openly flirting with another woman at their own party, the party she had planned to celebrate their coming child, when Jamie's falling body struck her with the force of a battering ram, sending them both plunging into the chlorinated depths that suddenly felt as cold as Arctic Ocean and twice as merciless. The water was shockingly brutal, a violent contrast to the warm evening air that had made the party feel like paradise before it became the setting for her personal apocalypse. Alison felt her evening gown, the one she had chosen specifically to hide her early pregnancy while still looking beautiful for this special announcement that was supposed to bring them closer together, tangle around her legs like seaweed designed by malevolent gods to drag her down. The weight of the wet fabric pulled her toward the bottom of her own pool with relentless determination. The dress that was supposed to make her beautiful for the most important moment of her marriage becoming a death trap that threatened to end her life before she could tell anyone about the new life growing inside her. Panic seized her throat like invisible hands, choking away her breath as chlorinated water rushed into her lungs, burning like acid and filling her with terror that transcended anything she had experienced during her homeless years, when death had been a daily possibility, but never quite this immediate or ironic. She thrashed desperately toward what she hoped was the surface, fighting against fabric and water and the growing realization that she might die in her own pool while her husband saved another woman. But she was 3 months pregnant with a child who had been conceived in love and was now threatened by betrayal, and pregnancy had robbed her of the agility and strength that might have saved her life under different circumstances. The baby she carried made her movements clumsy and uncoordinated, her body working to protect the life inside her, even as that protection threatened to cost them both everything. The elegant dress that was supposed to make her beautiful for this special announcement became a shroud that threatened to drag her to the bottom of the pool where she would die before she could tell the world about the miracle growing inside her body. Through the distorted lens of water and panic, through the chaos of chlorinated death and desperate struggling against forces that seemed determined to claim her life, Allison saw Tom leap into the pool without hesitation, his powerful form cutting through the air like a man diving to save his most precious possession. For a moment that felt like salvation itself arriving from heaven, hope blazed through her terror like sunshine, breaking through storm clouds that had threatened to destroy everything beautiful in the world. Her husband was coming to save her, to prove that their love still mattered more than whatever madness had possessed him lately, to choose his family over his temporary obsession with another woman. Then she realized he was swimming in the opposite direction, with powerful strokes that carried him away from his drowning wife and toward the woman who had destroyed their marriage. Tom's athletic form cut through the water with desperate urgency that revealed his true priorities more clearly than any words could have conveyed as he reached Jamie Hunter, whose red dress billowed around her like blood in the water, like a wound that was bleeding out everything good and pure in their world. He pulled her against his chest with the care of a man tending to his most precious possession, as if her life was the only one that mattered in the universe, while his pregnant wife fought for breath beneath the surface that might as well have been an ocean away from his attention. The guests screamed and pointed from the pool deck, their voices seeming to come from another dimension, as Allison watched her husband save another woman while she drowned in water that tasted of chlorine and broken dreams and the death of everything she had believed about love and loyalty and the man she had married. She felt something inside her break that would never heal, not just her heart, but her capacity to believe that love could triumph over selfishness, that marriage vows meant anything to men who viewed them as temporary contracts subject to cancellation when more attractive opportunities arose. "Someone help her!" Rebecca screamed from the pool deck, her voice cutting through the chaos like a sword through silk, pointing at Allison's struggling form with horror that reflected what everyone was witnessing. "She's drowning! Why isn't anyone helping her?" The question hung in the air, like an accusation directed at every guest who was watching a woman die while her husband rescued his mistress with devotion he had never shown his wife. The darkness was closing in around the edges of her vision, like curtains drawing shut on the final act of her marriage, when strong hands grabbed her shoulders and hauled her toward the surface with the efficiency of someone trained in emergency rescue procedures. Her savior wasn't her husband, who was supposed to love her more than life itself. It was Morgan Willis, a man she barely knew who had attended their party as a business acquaintance's guest, but possessed more honor than the man she had married. He had thrown off his expensive jacket without hesitation and dove into the pool fully clothed when it became clear that Tom had no intention of rescuing his own wife from the water that was claiming her life while he played hero for another woman. Morgan's powerful arms cut through the water that had nearly become Allison's grave, his legal training having included emergency response certification that now saved a life Tom was willing to sacrifice for his mistress's safety. Other guests helped lift her onto the deck with urgent efficiency, where she collapsed in a coughing, shivering heap that resembled nothing so much as a broken doll discarded by a careless child who had grown bored with toys that no longer entertained him. Pool water and champagne mixed with tears on the marble surface as Allison fought to breathe through lungs that felt filled with concrete and betrayal and the weight of understanding that her marriage had been a lie. "Call an ambulance!" Morgan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos with legal authority that commanded immediate obedience from guests who had been frozen in shock. "Now! And someone get her a blanket. She's going into shock from hypothermia and trauma." Through her haze of pain and oxygen deprivation that made the world seem like it was viewed through frosted glass, Allison saw Tom climbing out of the pool with Jamie in his arms, like a groom carrying his bride across the threshold into their new life together. He was speaking to her in urgent, tender tones that Allison recognized from their own courtship, words of love and concern that she had believed were reserved for her alone. Tom was checking Jamie for injuries with the care of a man tending to his most precious possession while completely ignoring his wife's fight for survival just 20 feet away, as if Allison had become invisible the moment he made his choice about which woman deserved to live. Jamie clung to him with theatrical desperation that would have been laughable if it weren't so effective, playing the role of damsel in distress with Academy Award-worthy conviction that fooled no one except the man whose judgment had been compromised by months of systematic manipulation and ego-stroking that had convinced him she was worth destroying his family to possess. Not once did Tom look in Allison's direction. Not once did he check to see if his wife was breathing, conscious, or even alive after the trauma that might have killed her and the baby she was carrying. The paramedics arrived within minutes that felt like hours of watching her husband tend to his mistress with devotion that should have belonged to his family, their professional competence a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that had erupted around the pool like a natural disaster striking paradise without warning. They loaded Allison onto a stretcher with efficient care, while Morgan provided rapid-fire answers to their medical questions with the precision of someone whose legal training had taught him to observe details that others missed, especially details that might become important in future legal proceedings. He had noticed things about her condition that her own husband had missed completely, the way she was protecting her abdomen even while drowning, the careful way she had been moving throughout the evening as if guarding something precious, the subtle signs that suggested she might be carrying more than just herself into this disaster that would reshape multiple lives. "Is she pregnant?" the lead paramedic asked quietly, checking her vital signs with practiced efficiency while preparing her for transport to trauma specialists. "I think so," Morgan replied, his hand finding Allison's as they wheeled her toward the ambulance that would carry her away from the scene of her marriage's death. "But she hasn't made any official announcement yet." Allison squeezed his hand with what little strength she possessed, grateful beyond words for this stranger's compassion, in a world where her own husband had abandoned her to die for the sake of impressing his mistress with heroics that revealed his true character. As the ambulance doors closed with finality that sounded like the closing of a coffin, she caught one last glimpse through tear-blurred eyes of the party that was supposed to have been her moment of triumph, her celebration of new life, her proof that love could overcome any obstacle. Tom was still focused entirely on Jamie, who was refusing medical attention with dramatic flair while accepting his devoted ministrations like a queen, receiving tribute from a devoted subject who had proven his loyalty by sacrificing his family on the altar of her ego. Tom Collins had made his choice in the water, and now everyone would live with the consequences of that single moment of moral bankruptcy that revealed his soul's true contents. Chapter 5. Shattered Dreams. Enhanced version. The human heart can survive many betrayals, but watching the man you love choose another woman over your unborn child breaks something that never heals. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and broken dreams, a sterile environment that couldn't mask the human tragedy unfolding within its white walls that had witnessed countless moments of loss, but rarely circumstances quite this cruel. Alison lay motionless in the narrow bed, her dark skin ashen against the white sheets that seemed to drain color from everything they touched, IV tubes snaking from her arms like mechanical vines, feeding life into a body that felt hollow and abandoned by hope itself. The elegant gown that was supposed to showcase her pregnancy announcement now lay in a plastic bag marked "Personal Effects," waterlogged and ruined beyond repair. Much like the marriage it had been meant to celebrate and the dreams it had been chosen to represent on what should have been the happiest night of her life. Morgan Willis had refused to leave the waiting room, despite having no legal right to be there, despite being a virtual stranger whose only connection to Alison was the moment he had pulled her from the water while her husband saved another woman. The uncomfortable visitor's chair had been designed for brief visits rather than the vigil he had maintained for 18 hours. His expensive suit wrinkled from diving into the pool and his eyes red from exhaustion and rage that he was struggling to contain. "Is there any family we should contact?" Nurse Patricia Williams asked Morgan with professional concern that couldn't quite hide her personal disgust at the circumstances. She had been working trauma cases for 15 years and had never seen a husband abandon his wife so completely during a medical emergency. Her husband was at the party, Morgan replied carefully, not wanting to reveal too much about domestic situations he didn't fully understand. He should have been contacted by now. Should have been, yes. Nurse Williams agreed with pointed emphasis that suggested she knew more about Tom's absence than professional courtesy allowed her to express directly. But some men have different priorities when their wives need them most. The medical team had been efficient and thorough, running tests that would determine whether the near drowning had caused complications beyond what was immediately visible. Dr. Elizabeth Chen emerged from the examination room with an expression that carried the weight of delivering news that would destroy worlds and reshape the understanding of loss for everyone who heard it. "The tests confirm what we suspected based on her symptoms and the way she was protecting her abdomen during the rescue," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying professional calm that couldn't mask the personal anger underneath. Mrs. Collins was approximately 12 weeks pregnant when she was admitted. The word "was" hung in the sterile air like a death sentence handed down by a judge who showed no mercy for dreams that had been murdered by circumstance and cruelty that defied basic human decency. Morgan felt his hands clench into fists as the full magnitude of what had happened crashed over him like waves against rocks that couldn't withstand the endless assault of truth. Not only had Tom Collins chosen to save his mistress over his wife in a moment that revealed his true character, he had cost them their unborn child through that choice, making his betrayal complete in ways that defied human understanding of cruelty and selfishness. "The miscarriage was caused by the stress of the near-drowning incident," Dr. Chen continued with clinical precision that couldn't mask her own disgust at the circumstances that had led to this preventable tragedy. The combination of oxygen deprivation, physical trauma, and extreme emotional shock created conditions that made pregnancy loss inevitable. In cases like this, where the mother experiences severe stress during the first trimester, the body often cannot maintain the pregnancy, even if the mother survives the initial trauma. Dr. Chen had seen many cases of pregnancy loss due to domestic violence during her career, but this situation was particularly cruel because the violence had been emotional rather than physical, the abandonment complete rather than partial, and the choice public rather than private, witnessed by dozens of people who would remember Tom's priorities for the rest of their lives. When Alison stirred, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness returned like dawn, breaking over a battlefield where only casualties remained. The medical team moved with practiced efficiency, while Morgan stepped back to allow professionals to do their work. "Mrs. Collins, you're safe. You're in Metro General Hospital," Dr. Chen said with gentle authority that had been trained to deliver terrible news with compassion that couldn't eliminate pain but could provide framework for processing it. Allison's eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to recognition, and then to devastating memory that crashed over her like waves, drowning someone who was already underwater. She tried to sit up, one hand instinctively moving to her abdomen in a gesture that broke everyone's heart who was watching, including medical professionals who had thought themselves immune to emotional involvement in their patients' tragedies. "The baby," she whispered, her voice raw from swallowing pool water and screaming underwater while fighting for breath that her husband should have helped her find. "Is my baby?" The silence that followed was answer enough, but Dr. Chen provided confirmation with words that would haunt everyone present. "I'm so sorry. The pregnancy couldn't be sustained after the trauma you experienced. We did everything possible, but the stress and oxygen deprivation were too severe for the baby to survive." The sound that escaped Allison's throat wasn't quite human. It was the noise a soul makes when it breaks beyond repair, when hope dies and takes innocence with it into whatever darkness waits for dreams that have been murdered by those who should have protected them from harm. Morgan squeezed her hand from where he stood beside the bed, offering the only support he could while she processed the loss of everything she had hoped for and planned for and believed would save the marriage that had died before she realized it was even sick. "Where's Tom?" she asked when she could speak again through throat that felt raw from screaming and crying and breathing water instead of air, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would destroy what little faith she had left in human decency. Nurse Williams exchanged glances with Dr. Chen before answering with professional diplomacy that barely concealed personal judgment. "We haven't been able to reach your husband yet, Mrs. Collins. The contact information we have seems to be unavailable." It was a polite way of saying that Tom Collins hadn't bothered to come to the hospital where his wife was fighting for her life and the life of their unborn child. "He's not here," Morgan said quietly, unable to keep the anger from his voice despite his professional training in maintaining emotional control during crisis situations. "He stayed at the party to take care of the other woman." The bitter laugh that escaped Allison's lips was worse than tears would have been, carrying despair that had crystallized into something harder and more dangerous than grief. Of course he did. Jamie Hunter always was more important than his wife. So she had known about the affair despite her husband's careful deceptions and elaborate lies designed to keep his betrayal secret while maximizing his access to both women's affections. Despite her own desperate desire to believe in their marriage and salvage something from the wreckage of her trust, Allison had known that Tom was betraying her with systematic cruelty that went beyond mere infidelity into territory that decent people couldn't navigate without losing their souls. "How long have you known about the affair?" Morgan asked gently, recognizing the signs of someone who had been carrying terrible knowledge alone while trying to maintain the facade of a happy marriage. "Months," Allison admitted, tears finally coming in waves that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than her eyes, from the place where hope goes to die when it realizes it has been feeding on lies and false promises. "I kept hoping I was wrong. I kept thinking that if I loved him harder, if I was a better wife, if I gave him the family he said he wanted more than anything." Her voice trailed off into the bitter realization that love could never compete with selfish desire backed by calculated manipulation from women who understood men's weaknesses better than wives understood their husbands' needs. It was then that Tom finally arrived, bursting through the hospital room door with theatrical panic that fooled no one who was paying attention to the timing of his entrance or the fact that he smelled like another woman's perfume mixed with chlorine from the pool where he had chosen his priorities. His tuxedo was still damp from his heroic rescue of his mistress, his hair disheveled in a way that suggested he had spent more time comforting Jamie than rushing to check on his wife's condition or the condition of the baby he hadn't even known existed. "Sir, visiting hours ended 2 hours ago." Nurse Williams intercepted him at the door with professional authority that carried personal judgment. "Mrs. Collins needs rest, and family members need to check with the nurse's station before—" "I'm her husband," Tom snapped with arrogance that made everyone in the room understand why his wife had nearly drowned while he saved his mistress. "Then you should have been here hours ago when she was admitted," Nurse Williams replied with ice in her voice that could have frozen hell itself, "while she was fighting for her life and the life of your baby." The word baby hit Tom like a physical blow that staggered him backward against the doorframe. His face went white as implications crashed over him like tsunami waves, carrying the debris of his destroyed conscience and moral reasoning. Morgan stepped forward, positioning himself between Tom and Allison's bed with protective instincts that had nothing to do with legal training and everything to do with basic human decency. "Maybe you should speak with the doctor first about your wife's condition before you upset her further with your presence." "Who the hell are you to tell me what to do?" Tom demanded, though his protest lacked conviction and sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I'm the man who saved your wife's life while you were playing hero for your mistress," Morgan replied with surgical precision that left no room for argument or deflection. "I'm also an attorney who specializes in representing women whose husbands abandon them during medical emergencies." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Tom found himself facing not just his wife's rescuer, but someone who understood legal systems and knew how to use them against men who failed their most basic responsibilities as husbands and fathers. Dr. Chen chose that moment to enter with test results that would reshape everyone's understanding of what Tom's choices had actually cost. "Mr. Collins, I need to speak with you about your wife's condition and the complications that resulted from tonight's incident." "What complications?" Tom asked, though his voice suggested he already feared the answer would destroy whatever remained of his ability to justify his actions to himself. "Your wife suffered a miscarriage caused by the trauma of nearly drowning," Dr. Chen replied with clinical detachment that made the words hit harder than emotional pleading could have accomplished. "She was 12 weeks pregnant, and the stress of the incident was too severe for the pregnancy to continue." Tom stared at his wife, who had turned her face toward the window to avoid looking at the man who had cost her their baby through choices that revealed character rather than circumstance. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the mechanical sounds of medical equipment that couldn't measure the depth of betrayal or quantify the magnitude of loss that filled the room like poison gas. "I didn't know," he whispered, reaching for Allison's hand with desperation that came too late to matter and carried no weight against months of systematic betrayal. "Allison, if I had known you were pregnant, you would have what?" she asked without turning from the window, her voice steady, despite tears that streamed down her cheeks like rivers, carrying away everything she had believed about love and loyalty. "Saved me instead of her? Put your family before your mistress? Actually acted like the husband you promised to be when you made vows that apparently meant nothing?" Tom had no answer, because they both knew the truth that his desperate lies couldn't hide or his money couldn't buy forgiveness for. Even if he had known about the pregnancy, even if he had understood what was at stake in that water, he still would have chosen Jamie because the affair had progressed too far and consumed too much of his soul for pregnancy to change his fundamental priorities or moral compass. "I think you should leave, Doctor," Chen said quietly, her medical authority carrying more weight than Tom's wealth or status could overcome. Your wife needs rest, and your presence is clearly causing additional stress that could complicate her recovery." Tom stood frozen for a moment, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning in his own cowardice and moral bankruptcy. Then he turned and left without another word, his expensive shoes echoing against hospital corridor tiles as he fled from consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. When he was gone, Alison finally allowed herself to collapse into grief that had been held back through sheer force of will. Morgan sat beside her bed, offering presence without judgment and strength, without expectation of anything in return beyond basic human decency. "He doesn't deserve you," Morgan said when her tears finally subsided. "No," Alison agreed, wiping her eyes with tissues that felt rough against skin made sensitive by salt water and betrayal. "He doesn't, but I loved him anyway, and that love just killed our baby." Alison Murphy had lost everything that mattered to her, and now she was ready to take everything that mattered to Tom. Chapter 6. The Great Escape, enhanced with active scenes. Freedom was just another word for having nothing left to lose. The safe house apartment felt like a cocoon where Alison Murphy could finally shed the skin of the woman who had trusted too much and loved too blindly. 3 days after losing her baby and her illusions, she sat in the window seat overlooking a tree-lined street where normal people lived normal lives without bodyguards or prenuptial agreements or husbands who chose mistresses over unborn children. The modest space was furnished with care but without luxury, comfortable chairs that invited rest rather than demanded admiration, books that had been chosen for content rather than appearance, and windows that offered views of real life instead of empire building that corrupted souls through its pursuit. The phone rang at exactly 3:47 p.m., cutting through silence that had become her first taste of peace in months. "Mrs. Murphy." The voice was unfamiliar, careful, respectful in ways that Tom's voice had stopped being years ago. "This is Morgan Willis. I wanted to check on your recovery and discuss some legal matters that require immediate attention." "I'm alive," Alison replied, her tone flat as week-old champagne, but carrying undertones of steel that hadn't been there when she was playing the role of devoted wife. "That's more than Tom expected when he left me to drown in my own pool." There was a pause that stretched long enough for Morgan to recognize the sound of someone who had moved beyond grief into something colder and infinitely more dangerous to men who underestimated women's capacity for strategic thinking. "There's something we need to discuss face to face," he said carefully, choosing words that wouldn't spook someone who had every reason to distrust anyone connected to her former life. "About your legal options, about making sure Tom Collins faces consequences for what he did to you and your baby." "Legal options," Alison's voice sharpened with interest that surprised them both with its intensity. "What kind of legal options are available to women whose husbands choose mistresses over unborn children? The kind that ensure men like your husband discover that actions have consequences they can't buy their way out of, no matter how much money they've stolen to finance their betrayals. I'll be there in an hour if you're willing to listen." When Morgan arrived carrying files that would reshape Alison's understanding of what justice could accomplish, he found her in jeans and a sweater that made her look vulnerable until you saw her eyes. Those eyes had changed fundamentally in the days since the hospital. They belonged to someone who had learned that nice girls get betrayed and broken women get even through methods that men like Tom never saw coming. "He's been calling my office every hour since you disappeared," Morgan reported, settling into the chair across from her while noting how she positioned herself to maintain visual contact with all exits, the wariness of someone who had learned that safety was an illusion that could be shattered without warning. "Demanding to know where you are, threatening lawsuits that would be thrown out of court, offering bribes that would be illegal if I accepted them, and career-ending if I reported them." "What exactly has he been offering?" Alison asked with curiosity that carried analytical precision rather than emotional investment. Money, obviously, but also business deals, political connections, access to exclusive events and social circles. Yesterday, he showed up at my office with a briefcase full of cash like some kind of movie villain who thinks everything has a price that can be negotiated. Alison absorbed this information with growing fascination at her husband's descent into desperation that revealed character flaws she had spent years ignoring. "What did you do?" "I had security escort him out while I filmed the entire interaction for evidence purposes. Attempted bribery of an officer of the court is a felony that carries serious jail time, and Tom just handed us another charge to add to the list we're building." For the first time since the hospital, Alison smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the look of someone discovering they possessed capacities for strategic thinking that had been dormant until activated by betrayal that went beyond ordinary human cruelty. "I want everything," she said suddenly, her voice carrying determination that made Morgan's pulse quicken with professional excitement and personal admiration for someone who refused to remain a victim. His money, his businesses, his reputation, his freedom. "I want him to lose everything he values more than the family we could have had together. That's going to require more than just divorce proceedings," Morgan warned, though his tone suggested he was already strategizing campaigns that would destroy Tom's life as thoroughly as Tom had destroyed hers. "We'll need to prove systematic fraud, tax evasion, maybe even racketeering if the evidence supports charges that's serious." Alison's transformation was visible in real time, like watching someone shed skin that no longer fit and reveal something stronger underneath. The grief-stricken woman was crystallizing into something harder, sharper, more focused with each passing moment of conversation about justice and consequences. "Then find it," she said, with steel in her voice that could cut through any defense Tom's lawyers might construct. "You said you specialize in destroying men like Tom. Prove it." Morgan opened his briefcase, revealing preliminary evidence that suggested Tom's crimes went far deeper than simple adultery. Financial records, email printouts, and transaction histories painted a picture of systematic theft that had been disguised as legitimate business for years. "This is just the beginning," he explained, watching Alison study each document with intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail for future use. Tom Collins built his empire through shortcuts and criminal activity that seemed clever at the time, but created vulnerabilities that skilled investigators can exploit. As autumn settled over the city like a blanket covering the evidence of summer's warmth, Alison found herself looking forward to the coming battle with anticipation that would have made her former self unrecognizable to anyone who had known her as Tom's devoted wife. The hunting season was about to begin, and this time Tom Collins was the prey being stalked by predators who understood his weaknesses better than he understood his own character. Chapter 7. The Lawyer's Strategy. Justice was a dish best served with overwhelming evidence and surgical precision. Morgan Willis spread the documents across his conference table like a general preparing for war. 6 months of investigation had yielded a treasure trove of evidence that would destroy Tom Collins more thoroughly than any bomb could devastate a building. The mahogany surface disappeared under bank records, photographs, email printouts, and legal affidavits that painted a picture of systematic fraud, tax evasion, and criminal negligence that spanned nearly a decade. Alison sat across from him, her transformation from grieving wife to avenging angel now complete. The woman who had once trusted her husband completely had learned to trust nothing and verify everything with the paranoia of someone who had been betrayed by the person closest to her. She studied each document with the intensity of a scholar reading sacred texts, memorizing details that would become weapons in their war against the man who had destroyed her life. "Tell me again why you do this," she said, looking up from a particularly damning financial report that showed millions in diverted funds. Why do you specialize in destroying men like Tom? Morgan leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes reflecting memories that still carried fresh pain despite the passage of years. Because, 15 years ago, I watched my sister's husband choose his mistress over his family. When my sister tried to leave, he used his wealth and connections to destroy her custody case through legal manipulation and judicial corruption. What happened to her? She lost her kids, her home, her entire life because she married a man who viewed love as weakness and loyalty as stupidity that deserved punishment. Morgan continued with the flat tone of someone who had learned to speak about unspeakable things. She couldn't live knowing her children were being raised by the man who had betrayed her and the woman who had helped him do it. And then, suicide, Morgan replied simply. She couldn't live knowing her children were being raised by the man who had betrayed her and the woman who had helped him do it. Allison reached across the table and touched his hand, understanding passing between them without words needing to be spoken. They were both survivors of men who used love as a weapon, both refugees from marriages that had become battlefields where only one side knew there was a war being fought. I specialized in family law after that, Morgan continued. Built a practice that focuses on cases like yours, wealthy, powerful men who think money makes them untouchable. I've learned that the bigger they are, the more secrets they have, and secrets always leave trails that can be followed by someone patient enough to look. The trail they had followed through Tom's finances had revealed corruption so extensive it made Bernie Madoff look like an amateur shoplifter. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands held hundreds of millions in undeclared income that should have been reported to federal authorities. Shell companies in Delaware existed solely to launder money through complex transactions that avoided taxation while enriching Tom personally. Business deals had been structured to defraud investors while creating the appearance of legitimate commerce. Pension funds had been raided to finance Tom's personal projects. Government contracts had been obtained through bribes disguised as consulting fees. The scope of his crimes was breathtaking in its audacity and systematic in its execution. But the financial crimes were just the foundation. The real ammunition lay in the personal evidence they had gathered: hotel receipts that documented his affair with Jamie Hunter, credit card statements that showed expensive gifts purchased for his mistress, and digital communications that revealed the depth of his deception and contempt for his marriage. The beauty of going after someone like Tom, Morgan explained as he organized photographs that showed Tom and Jamie entering hotels on the same days his calendar showed him in business meetings, is that they're so arrogant they never think they'll get caught. They document their own crimes because they believe money makes them immune to consequences. Allison studied a photograph of Tom and Jamie kissing in the back seat of his limousine, taken by a private investigator 2 weeks before the pool incident. The image was clear enough to eliminate any possibility of plausible deniability or innocent explanation. This was taken the same day he told me he couldn't come to my doctor's appointment because of a board meeting, she said with bitter satisfaction that felt like justice beginning to take shape. He missed the ultrasound, where we would have heard our baby's heartbeat for the first time. Morgan felt familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to dedicate his career to destroying men who betrayed their families with casual cruelty. We're going to make him pay for every lie, every betrayal, every moment of selfishness. What's the full strategy? Allison asked, her voice carrying the calm of someone who had moved beyond emotion into pure calculation. Morgan opened his laptop and pulled up the comprehensive plan they had been building for months, like architects designing the perfect building. Phase 1 is the divorce filing, which requests everything, all assets, all businesses, all properties. We're claiming adultery, emotional abuse, and financial fraud as grounds. Will that be enough? That's just the opening move. Phase 2 involves criminal charges for tax evasion and fraud. I have contacts in the IRS and SEC who are very interested in Tom's creative accounting methods. Phase 3 targets his business relationships. When his partners learn about his criminal exposure, they'll distance themselves to protect their own interests. Allison nodded with grim satisfaction. And Phase 4? Phase 4 is the complete destruction of his public image. The man who built his reputation on marrying a homeless woman will be exposed as someone who abandoned that same woman when she needed him most. The media loves a fall from grace story, especially when it involves hypocrisy on this scale. The plan was elegant in its thoroughness, devastating in its precision. They would attack Tom on every front simultaneously: legal, financial, criminal, and social. By the time they were finished, he would lose everything he had valued more than his marriage. "There's something else," Morgan said, his tone becoming more serious. "Jamie Hunter isn't just a random mistress. She's been positioning herself strategically within your husband's business network. I think this affair was planned from the beginning. She targeted Tom specifically because of his wealth and vulnerability." Allison processed this information with the calm of someone who had already lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to fear. "You think she's been playing him?" "I think she's been playing everyone, including you. The question is whether we can prove it and whether she's smart enough to abandon ship when things get ugly." The war was about to begin, and this time, Tom Collins would discover what it felt like to be abandoned when he needed someone most. Chapter 8. The Web Tightens, enhanced with active scenes. A man's empire always collapses from within, built as it was on the foundation of his own character. The parking garage beneath the federal building was designed for anonymity, concrete pillars casting shadows that could hide secrets, security cameras positioned to create blind spots that experienced whistleblowers knew how to exploit. Morgan Willis checked his watch as footsteps echoed through the underground space, each sound amplified by acoustics that made every movement seem threatening. At 11:47 p.m., exactly as scheduled, a figure emerged from behind a pillar. Sarah Chen had been Tom's chief financial officer for 7 years, long enough to know where every body was buried and every dollar was hidden. Her hands shook as she approached Morgan, clutching a briefcase that contained the keys to destroying her former employer. "I shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, her voice echoing off concrete walls that had witnessed 1,000 similar exchanges between conscience and self-preservation. "But you're doing it anyway," Morgan replied with gentle authority, "because you know what Tom Collins really is." Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "I know he's been stealing from pension funds to finance his affairs. I know he's hidden $400 million in accounts that don't officially exist. I know he planned to divorce his wife the day after their baby was born to avoid looking like he abandoned a pregnant woman." She opened the briefcase, revealing flash drives, documents, and printed emails that represented years of criminal activity, documented by someone who had been forced to participate, but had refused to stay silent forever. "This contains everything," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Bank records, wire transfers, audio recordings of Tom planning tax evasion strategies, everything you need to put him away for life." Morgan accepted the briefcase with reverence appropriate to receiving evidence that would deliver justice for crimes that had destroyed innocent lives. "Why now? Why are you coming forward?" "Because I was at that party," Sarah replied, tears mixing with rain that had begun falling through the garage's ventilation system. "I watched him choose his mistress over his pregnant wife. I watched a good woman nearly die while he played hero for a calculating bitch who was recording everything for her own protection." Sarah wiped her eyes with hands that still trembled from the magnitude of what she was revealing. "I have a daughter, Mr. Willis. Someday she might marry a man like Tom Collins. I want her to live in a world where such men face consequences for destroying families." "You're doing the right thing," Morgan assured her, though they both knew the right thing often came with prices that honest people had to pay while criminals escaped accountability. "I know," Sarah replied with quiet dignity. "That's why I'm doing it despite the cost to my own career and safety." 3 days later, the cracks in Tom's empire became visible to everyone who had eyes to see and intelligence to interpret what they were witnessing. The Regency Hotel's private dining room had been Tom's favorite venue for entertaining clients who required discretion and luxury in equal measure. But tonight, the atmosphere felt poisonous as Tom faced David Morrison, the client whose account had provided the cover for his affair with Jamie Hunter. "I'm terminating our relationship," Morrison announced without preamble, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Effective immediately." Tom nearly choked on his wine. "David, we've been partners for 8 years. The returns on your investments have been exceptional." "The returns were built on money stolen from other clients," Morrison interrupted, sliding a folder across the mahogany table. "I know about the shell companies. I know about the Cayman accounts. I know you've been using my legitimate investments as cover for criminal activity." Tom opened the folder with hands that had begun shaking uncontrollably. Inside were photocopies of bank records, transaction histories, and financial documents that should have been impossible for Morrison to access without inside help. "Where did you get these?" Tom demanded, though he already suspected the answer would terrify him. "From people who work for you, people who got tired of being accessories to crimes they never signed up to commit." Morrison stood, straightening his tie with the satisfaction of a man who had just avoided legal contamination through decisive action, people who decided their consciences were worth more than their paychecks. Tom watched his most important client walk away, noting how the restaurant staff avoided eye contact as Morrison passed their stations. Even the waiters knew that Tom Collins had become persona non grata in circles where reputation mattered more than money. Back at his penthouse, that felt more like a mausoleum with each passing day, Tom poured his 4th drink of the evening and dialed Jamie's number with fingers that barely functioned due to alcohol and stress. "We need to talk," he said when she answered after 6 rings. "I'm busy," Jamie replied, her voice carrying distance that hadn't been there during their passionate months of secret meetings. "Busy with what? I'm falling apart here and you're busy." The silence stretched between them like a chasm that was growing wider with each passing second. "Tom," Jamie said finally, her tone carrying the patience reserved for explaining simple concepts to slow children, "I think we should take a break until things calm down." "Take a break?" Tom's voice rose to a pitch that would have embarrassed him if he had retained any capacity for shame. "Jamie, I left my wife for you. I risked everything for you. You can't just—" "I never asked you to leave your wife," Jamie interrupted with clinical precision. "I never asked you to risk anything. Those were your choices, made for your reasons." The phone went dead in Tom's hand, leaving him alone with the echo of his own desperation bouncing off walls that had once seemed to promise infinite possibility, but now felt like they were closing in to crush everything he had foolishly believed he could control. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled with lights that represented other people's intact lives, other people's successful marriages, other people's families that hadn't been destroyed by selfish choices disguised as romantic destiny. Tom Collins was learning that when you burn bridges to reach what you think you want, you often discover that what you wanted was never worth the flames that consumed everything you actually needed. Tom Collins was about to learn that some women don't just leave, they take everything with them when they go. Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. The difference between justice and revenge is that justice requires patience. The war room Morgan Willis had created in his law firm's top floor looked like the command center for overthrowing a government, complete with secure communication lines and evidence storage that would make the FBI envious. Wall-mounted monitors displayed Tom's financial networks in real time, tracking every transaction and movement of assets as federal agencies closed their net around his criminal empire with the inexorable patience of professional hunters who had cornered dangerous prey. Evidence boxes lined the walls like ammunition carefully sorted by caliber and target, each one containing another piece of the puzzle that would destroy the man who had once seemed untouchable through wealth and influence. Financial records, photographs, audio recordings, video surveillance, witness statements, and expert analysis filled filing cabinets that required their own security system. Allison stood before the largest monitor, studying a complex diagram that showed the flow of stolen money through dozens of shell companies and offshore accounts, like a river system designed to hide the source of its tributaries from investigators who lacked the patience to follow every stream to its source. 8 months of investigation had revealed corruption so systematic it required its own organizational chart to understand fully and completely. Tom hadn't just committed fraud, he had built an entire parallel financial system designed to steal from his own investors while enriching himself through methods that would have impressed organized crime families with their sophistication and ruthlessness. The grand jury indictment comes down tomorrow, Morgan announced, entering the room with documents that would reshape Tom's understanding of consequences and accountability in ways that would haunt his remaining years. 18 federal charges, including tax evasion, wire fraud, mail fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. If convicted on all counts, he's looking at 47 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The charges read like a textbook on white-collar crime, each one carrying penalties that would ensure Tom died in prison if the government could prove their case. Morgan was confident they could prove everything twice over with evidence that would make conviction inevitable. "And the divorce settlement?" Allison asked, without turning from the monitor that displayed her former husband's crimes in meticulous detail, color-coded by severity and legal implications. Uncontested as of this morning, his lawyers advised him that fighting a divorce while facing criminal charges would be tactical suicide that would harm both cases beyond repair. "You get everything: the penthouse, the company assets, the offshore accounts we've managed to freeze before he could move them to countries that don't cooperate with American law enforcement." Allison nodded with satisfaction that had grown deeper and colder over the months of preparation, planning, and systematic destruction of the man who had destroyed her family. The woman who had once wanted nothing more than Tom's love now wanted his complete annihilation with religious fervor that surprised even her with its intensity and focus. The transformation had been gradual but thorough. Grief had burned away her naivety like acid-dissolving metal, betrayal had hardened her heart into something that could cut diamond, and loss had taught her that mercy was a luxury reserved for people who had never been abandoned while carrying their betrayer's child in their womb. She was no longer Allison Murphy, the homeless woman who had been rescued by a billionaire's love. She was Allison Murphy, the avenging angel who would rescue other women from men like Tom Collins through systematic destruction of everything he valued more than human decency. "There's more," Morgan continued, his tone carrying the satisfaction of a man about to deliver a killing blow that had been years in the making. "Jamie Hunter contacted our office yesterday through intermediaries. She wants to make a deal." This revelation stopped Allison's study of financial charts that mapped Tom's corruption like a roadmap to hell, paved with other people's money. She turned to face Morgan with eyebrows raised in surprise and cold calculation that would have made her unrecognizable to the trusting wife she had once been. "What kind of deal?" "Full cooperation in exchange for immunity from prosecution for her role in the financial crimes." It turns out Jamie has been documenting her relationship with Tom from the beginning. Photographs, recordings, written communications that detail every aspect of their affair and his criminal activities. She kept records of everything like she was conducting her own investigation while pretending to be his devoted lover. The irony was breathtaking in its completeness and perfect timing. Tom's careful mistress had been even more calculating than they had imagined, creating an insurance policy against the man she was helping to betray his wife while gathering evidence that could destroy him if their relationship soured. Jamie Hunter had never been in love with Tom Collins. She had been conducting corporate espionage disguised as romance. "She recorded him confessing to crimes?" Allison asked, fascination competing with disgust at the thoroughness of Jamie's deception and preparation for eventual betrayal. "Audio, video, everything, including his confessions about hiding assets from you, his plans to divorce you after the baby was born so he could marry her without scandal affecting his business relationships, and his detailed knowledge of the financial crimes he's been committing for years. Jamie Hunter just handed us enough evidence to guarantee conviction on every charge while destroying any possibility of successful appeal." Allison absorbed this information with the calm of someone who had learned to expect betrayal from every direction and every person who claimed to care about Tom Collins more than their own survival. Why is she turning on him now? Because she's smarter than Tom gave her credit for, and she recognizes that his empire is collapsing faster than the Titanic while taking everyone associated with him down into the depths. She knows his world is ending, and she doesn't want to go down with it. Better to be the government's star witness with immunity than Tom's co-defendant facing decades in federal prison. The government's case against Tom was now so overwhelming that plea bargains were impossible and legal defense was purely theoretical exercise in professional courtesy. His own lawyers had begun distancing themselves, citing ethical concerns about representing someone whose crimes were so extensively documented that defending him would be professional suicide that could destroy their own careers. The man who had once commanded armies of legal talent worth thousands of dollars per hour was reduced to public defenders who viewed his case as career-ending assignment that no one wanted and everyone tried to avoid through bureaucratic maneuvering. But the legal destruction was only part of Morgan's comprehensive strategy, designed to ensure Tom never recovered from his fall, even if he somehow avoided maximum prison sentences. The real masterpiece was the social and professional annihilation that would ensure his name became synonymous with betrayal and corruption in business circles that valued reputation above everything else. Business partners were being shown evidence of his crimes before it became public knowledge, giving them opportunity to sever relationships before the scandal destroyed their own reputations through association with a man who had become toxic to everything he touched. Board members were receiving anonymous packages containing proof of Tom's affairs and financial misconduct, complete with documentation that made denial impossible and distance necessary for their own survival in an industry that punished association with criminals. The tech industry, which had once celebrated Tom as a visionary leader whose success inspired others to achieve greatness, was systematically excising him from their community like surgeons removing cancer that threatened the health of the entire organism. Speaking engagements were cancelled without explanation, board positions were revoked through emergency votes conducted in secret, and business relationships that had taken decades to build were dissolved overnight through carefully worded letters that cited strategic differences and evolving priorities. "He called me yesterday," Allison revealed during one of their final preparation meetings before the trial that would end Tom's freedom forever. "Begging me to come back, promising to change everything about himself, threatening to kill himself if I didn't forgive him and return to save him from the consequences of his own choices." "Classic abuser tactics," Morgan replied with clinical detachment born from representing dozens of women who had heard identical threats from men who viewed suicide threats as negotiation tactics. Promise everything, threaten self-harm, deny responsibility for the situation they created through their own decisions and moral failures. Did you record the call? Every word. He admitted to the affair, to lying about the business trips, to planning to leave me after the baby was born so he could marry Jamie without the scandal affecting his business relationships. He thinks desperation makes him honest when it just makes him stupid enough to confess everything we need to destroy him completely in court. Tom Collins was about to face the judgment he had been running from his entire life, and this time there would be no escape through money, influence, or charm. Cancer that threatened the health of the entire organism. Speaking engagements were cancelled without explanation. Board positions were revoked through emergency votes, and business relationships that had taken decades to build were dissolved overnight through carefully worded letters that cited strategic differences and evolving priorities. "He called me yesterday," Allison revealed during one of their final preparation meetings, begging me to come back, promising to change, threatening to kill himself if I didn't forgive him and return to save him from the consequences of his own choices. "Classic abuser tactics," Morgan replied with clinical detachment born from representing dozens of women who had heard identical threats. Promise everything, threaten self-harm, deny responsibility for the situation they created through their own decisions. Did you record the call? Every word. He admitted to the affair, to lying about the business trips, to planning to leave me after the baby was born so he could marry Jamie without the scandal affecting his business relationships. He thinks desperation makes him honest when it just makes him stupid enough to confess everything we need to destroy him completely. The recorded confession would be the final nail in Tom's coffin, his own words condemning him more thoroughly than any prosecutor could manage through legal argument or evidence presentation. As the trial date approached, Tom's isolation became complete and absolute. Jamie had moved to another city under federal protection, preparing to testify against the man she had once claimed to love with passion that had seemed real enough to fool even experienced observers. His business empire was under government control, managed by court-appointed administrators, while criminal proceedings determined its final fate and ownership. Even the penthouse where he had once felt like a king was being prepared for seizure as proceeds of criminal activity. Tom Collins was about to face the judgment he had been running from his entire life, and this time there would be no escape. Chapter 10. Justice Served. The courtroom was where powerful men learned they were only human after all. Judge Patricia Hawthorne commanded her courtroom with the authority of someone who had seen every possible variation of human weakness and refused to be impressed by wealth, status, or carefully constructed public images designed to hide fundamental character flaws. As she looked down at Tom Collins from her bench, her expression carried the weight of justice that had been delayed but would not be denied. Tom sat at the defendant's table looking like a ghost of his former self, a shadow of the man who had once commanded respect through fear and admiration through achievement. 8 months of federal investigation, media scrutiny, and social exile had stripped away the polished exterior that had once made him seem untouchable. His expensive suit couldn't hide the tremor in his hands, and his practiced confidence had been replaced by the desperate energy of a cornered animal facing inevitable destruction. "Your Honor," Assistant District Attorney Williams began, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a prosecutor who knew he had an unbeatable case supported by overwhelming evidence. "The evidence will show that Tom Collins committed systematic fraud over a period of 7 years, stealing approximately $400 million from investors while hiding assets in offshore accounts to avoid taxation and legal accountability. But the criminal charges were just the appetizer in this feast of justice. The main course was the civil case, where Allison Murphy would claim everything Tom had built through his crimes and betrayal, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his choices. Allison sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing a simple black dress that emphasized her dignity rather than her loss. The woman who had once sought only to please her husband now carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had survived hell and emerged stronger. Beside her, Morgan Willis reviewed notes that would destroy a man's life with surgical precision and legal thoroughness that left no room for appeal or mercy. She had refused Morgan's suggestion to stay away from the proceedings, insisting on watching as justice was finally served to the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about witnessing the natural consequences of choices that Tom had made freely and repeatedly. The people called Jamie Hunter to the stand. The courtroom stirred as Jamie entered, her transformation from seductive mistress to government witness complete and carefully calculated. She wore a conservative blue suit that made her look trustworthy and remorseful, though Allison could see the calculation behind her performance like a predator recognizing another predator. Jamie was saving herself by destroying Tom, and she was doing it with the same cold efficiency she had once used to seduce him. "Ms. Hunter," the prosecutor began with the formal politeness reserved for witnesses whose testimony would decide fates, "please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant." "Tom Collins and I had an intimate relationship that lasted approximately 8 months, Jamie replied, with practiced honesty that revealed nothing about her own manipulation of the situation while exposing every detail of Tom's crimes. "During that time, he confided in me about his business practices, his plans to divorce his wife, and his methods for hiding money from federal authorities." Tom's lawyer objected with desperate energy, but the damage was already done and irreversible. Jamie's testimony painted Tom as a man who had planned his wife's abandonment while stealing from his own investors, with the casual cruelty of someone who viewed other people as resources to be exploited rather than humans deserving of basic decency. She produced recordings that captured Tom's voice, describing his crimes in his own words, photographs that documented their affair in humiliating detail, and financial records that showed how he had used company funds to pay for their hotel encounters while telling his wife he was attending business meetings. "Did Mr. Collins ever express remorse about his treatment of his wife?" the prosecutor asked. "Never," Jamie replied with devastating certainty that cut through the courtroom like a sword through silk. "He told me she was weak, that she held him back from achieving his full potential, that marrying her had been a publicity stunt that outlived its usefulness." Allison felt no pain at hearing these words. She had moved beyond hurt into something colder and more permanent than mere emotional reaction. This public confirmation of Tom's contempt for their marriage only strengthened her resolve to take everything he valued in return for everything he had taken from her. When Jamie finished her testimony, she walked past Tom's table without a glance, her expensive heels clicking against marble floors with the sound of nails being driven into a coffin. The woman who had once whispered promises of love and loyalty had just delivered the death blow to the man who had risked everything for her attention and received nothing but betrayal in return. Tom watched her leave with the expression of someone finally understanding that he had been played by a master manipulator who made his own deceptions look amateur and pathetic. The people call Morgan Willis to the stand. Morgan's testimony was clinical in its precision and devastating in its thoroughness. As both witness and Allison's attorney, he walked the jury through the timeline of Tom's betrayal with the skill of someone who had made a career of exposing men who used their power to destroy the women who loved them. "Mr. Willis, you were present at the party where the incident occurred. Please describe what you witnessed with your own eyes." "I saw Mr. Collins make a choice that revealed his true character beyond any possibility of misinterpretation," Morgan replied, his voice carrying the authority of unshakable truth. "When both women fell into the pool, he immediately swam to save his mistress while leaving his pregnant wife to drown. I had to rescue Mrs. Murphy myself while her husband tended to his lover." "Did Mr. Collins know his wife was pregnant at the time of this incident?" She was preparing to announce the pregnancy at that party. The entire gathering was planned to celebrate their coming baby. Mr. Collins chose to save his mistress instead of the mother of his unborn child, and that choice cost them both the baby and the marriage. The jury's reaction was immediate and visible, their faces reflecting the disgust that decent people feel when confronted with fundamental human failure. Several members looked at Tom with revulsion that no amount of legal maneuvering could overcome. Others shook their heads with the disappointment reserved for witnessing someone fall from grace through their own moral bankruptcy. Tom's defense attorney made valiant attempts to humanize his client, to present the affair as a moment of weakness rather than systematic betrayal that revealed character rather than circumstance. But the evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the defendant's character indefensible by any reasonable standard. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor concluded his closing argument with the gravity appropriate to the moment, "Tom Collins is a man who stole from his investors, betrayed his wife, and chose his mistress over his unborn child. The evidence proves beyond reasonable doubt that he is guilty of every charge brought against him and deserving of the maximum penalty allowed by law." The jury deliberated for 37 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Tom's conviction on 18 federal charges carried a sentence of 42 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, effectively ensuring he would die in captivity for his crimes. The civil judgment awarded Allison every asset Tom had accumulated through his crimes, approximately $3.8 billion in total value, making her one of the wealthiest women in America and leaving Tom with nothing but his prison uniform and the knowledge that his choices had cost him everything. But the financial victory was secondary to the emotional justice Allison felt watching her ex-husband led away in handcuffs that marked the end of his freedom and the beginning of accountability he had avoided his entire adult life. As the courtroom emptied, Morgan approached Allison with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal hope that had been building for months. "It's over," he said simply. "No," Allison replied, watching Tom disappear through the door that would lead to the rest of his life in captivity. "It's just beginning." 6 months later, Morgan found Allison in the garden of her new home, a beautiful but modest house that represented healing rather than dominance, peace rather than power. She had used Tom's stolen billions to establish foundations that helped homeless women, funded legal aid for abuse victims, and supported medical research into pregnancy loss. The money tainted by his crimes was being purified through acts of genuine compassion. "I have something to ask you," Morgan said, his usual legal confidence replaced by nervous vulnerability that made him seem younger and more human. Allison looked up from the roses she was planting, her face reflecting peace that had been earned through surviving hell and choosing to build heaven from its ashes. The woman who had once defined herself through her husband's love had learned to find worth in her own strength and purpose in helping others avoid her fate. Morgan dropped to one knee beside the flower bed, producing a ring that was elegant but not ostentatious, beautiful but not desperate to impress through size or expense. "I know we met under terrible circumstances," he began, his voice carrying honesty that Tom had never been capable of offering. "I know you've been through trauma that most people couldn't survive without losing their capacity for trust and love. But I also know that you're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met. Will you marry me, not because you need rescuing, but because I want to build a life with someone who understands that love means choosing each other every day?" Allison looked at the ring, then at the man offering it, then at the garden they had planted together in soil that had once seemed barren but now bloomed with possibility. This proposal was everything Tom's had never been. Honest about difficulty, realistic about commitment, based on respect rather than rescue. "Yes," she said, accepting the ring and the future it represented. "But only if you promise never to save anyone else from drowning while I'm in the water." Morgan laughed, the sound carrying joy that had been earned through choosing justice over convenience, truth over comfort, and love over everything else that mattered less. Meanwhile, in a federal prison 3 states away, Tom Collins sat in a cell that measured 8 feet by 10 feet, wondering how a man who had once owned everything could lose it all to the woman he had underestimated most completely. The concrete walls reflected his voice when he spoke to himself, the only conversation partner who would listen to his regrets and justifications. Jamie Hunter had fled to Europe, where extradition laws provided protection from the fraud charges that would eventually catch up with her when international cooperation made her location irrelevant. She had escaped with enough money to live comfortably but not luxuriously, learning that playing with billionaires' hearts was profitable until those billionaires went to prison and took their empires with them. The last newspaper article about the case ran with the headline, "From Homeless to Billionaire, Abuse Victim Inherits Empire After Exposing Husband's Crimes." The story included a photograph of Allison and Morgan on their wedding day, surrounded by friends who had supported them through the darkest period of their lives and witnesses to their triumph over evil that had worn the mask of love. Tom Collins had lost everything to the woman he thought was weak and discovered too late that strength comes not from power, but from refusing to be broken by those who wield it.